A lot of people hear the word vegetable and immediately relax. It sounds clean, safe, even protective. And in many cases, that instinct is absolutely right. Fresh vegetables are one of the best things you can put on your plate. But there is one version of a vegetable that can turn from something helpful into something surprisingly dangerous, especially if you are older, already dealing with high blood pressure, or eating it at the wrong time of day. And that is exactly why this conversation matters. Because the food I'm talking about does not look threatening at all. It might be sitting quietly beside a sandwich, served next to dinner, added to a salad, or pulled straight from a jar in the fridge. It may even taste sharp, refreshing, and harmless. But under the surface, it can deliver something your blood vessels may not handle well, especially overnight. I'm Dr. Marcus Evans, medical doctor and physician. And on this channel, I break down health topics in a way that helps you understand what may really be happening inside your body, so you can make clearer, safer, everyday decisions. And if that kind of practical health guidance is helpful to you, subscribe and stay with me. Now, when I say I am shocked by this vegetable, I do not mean that every bite will harm every person. I also do not mean vegetables are bad. That would be nonsense. What I mean is that one very common type of vegetable is hiding behind a healthy reputation while carrying a risk most people never stop to think about. I'm talking about salty preserved vegetables, pickled cucumbers, pickled cabbage, certain jarred vegetable mixes, salt-heavy fermented vegetables, preserved greens. Foods that still wear the label of vegetable but behave very differently once they have been soaked, cured, packed, or preserved in a high-sodium environment. That is where the problem begins. Because once you take a naturally healthy food and load it with salt, you are no longer dealing with that food in its original form. You are dealing with a sodium delivery system that just happens to be wearing a vegetable costume. And for someone with healthy kidneys, flexible blood vessels, and stable blood pressure, the body may handle that load reasonably well. But that is not the reality for millions of adults, especially after 60. As we age, blood vessels tend to become less elastic. The body also becomes less forgiving. Blood pressure control may be weaker. Kidney function may not be as efficient as it once was. Fluid balance may shift more easily. And many people are already living with hypertension, diabetes, heart disease, kidney strain, or a history of mini strokes without fully realizing how sensitive their systems have become. That is why a food can look small on the plate and still create a much bigger reaction inside the body than expected. Now here is where people get misled. They look at a pickle spear, a spoonful of sauerkraut, a serving of preserved cabbage, or a side of marinated vegetables and think, how bad could this possibly be? It's just a vegetable. It's not fried chicken. It's not a bag of chips. It's not fast food. But the body does not judge food by appearance or by marketing language. Actually, the human body reacts purely to chemistry. And one of the fastest ways to create trouble in a person who is salt sensitive is to overwhelm the system with sodium. That sounds small, but it is not, because sodium changes fluid balance. It changes pressure. It changes what the circulation has to manage. And when that pressure begins to rise in a body that is already vulnerable, the danger is not always dramatic at first. Sometimes it is silent. Sometimes it builds while the person feels fine. Sometimes it shows up later, not during the meal itself, but hours afterward, when the body is supposed to be resting. That is why the word overnight in this title is so important. Many people assume that if food is going to cause a problem, it will happen immediately. They expect a stomach issue, a headache, or some obvious warning sign right away. But blood pressure does not always work like that. The body can respond gradually over several hours. Fluid may be retained. Blood vessels may come under more strain. And in some people, the real pressure spike happens during the night or shows up the next morning, when the cardiovascular system is already moving through one of its most vulnerable windows. And this is where the story gets more serious. Because the danger is not really the cucumber, or the cabbage, or the carrot, or the pepper. The danger is the transformation. It is what happened to that vegetable before it reached your plate, how much sodium it absorbed, how concentrated it became, how easily a small portion can carry a much larger salt load than the average person expects. A person may be careful all day long, then sit down in the evening and eat what seems like a light meal. Maybe some soup, maybe a sandwich, maybe processed meat, maybe cheese, maybe crackers. And then on the side, a few salty pickled vegetables. Nothing looks extreme, nothing feels reckless, but together, that meal may be stacking sodium in a way the body will pay for later. And that is the part almost nobody talks about. Not the food in isolation, but the timing. Not the label, but the load. Not the vegetable itself, but what it becomes once salt gets involved. So before anyone dismisses this as an overreaction, understand what I'm saying clearly. Fresh vegetables are still some of the best foods you can eat. This is not a message of fear. It is a message of precision. Because if you treat every vegetable as automatically safe in every form, you may miss the one version that quietly pushes your blood pressure in the wrong direction when your body is least prepared to handle it. And once you understand that, the next question becomes much more important. What exactly does that sodium do inside the bloodstream? And why can it become so risky while you are asleep? To understand why this can become dangerous, you have to stop thinking about the food as just something sitting in the stomach and start thinking about what it does once it enters the body. Because the real issue is not the crunch. It is not the vinegar. It is not even the vegetable itself. The real issue is the sodium load that comes with it, and what that load can do to fluid balance, blood vessel tension, and blood pressure regulation over the next several hours. Here is the simplest way to think about it. Sodium pulls water. When you eat a food that is heavily loaded with sodium, your body often responds by holding on to more fluid in order to maintain balance in the bloodstream. That means the volume inside the circulation can increase, and when you increase the volume moving through blood vessels that may already be stiff, narrowed, inflamed, or less responsive than they used to be, pressure can begin to rise. That is not a theory, that is physiology. Your heart is pushing blood through a network of vessels every second of the day. If those vessels are flexible and healthy, they can absorb changes more smoothly. But if those vessels have lost some of their elasticity, which is common with age, long-term high blood pressure, diabetes, chronic inflammation, or vascular disease, then even a modest increase in fluid pressure can matter more than people realize. Think of it like this. Imagine water moving through a hose that is soft and flexible. There is room to adapt. Now imagine that same water trying to move through a hose that has become stiffer, tighter, and less forgiving. The same increase in pressure creates more strain. That is much closer to what happens in aging arteries. They do not always respond gently. They can become harder, less compliant, and more vulnerable to pressure swings. And that is exactly why some people can eat salty foods and seem fine, while others wake up with elevated blood pressure, swelling, headaches, or a sense that something feels off. Now, not everyone responds to sodium in the same way. This is where something called salt sensitivity becomes important. Some people's blood pressure rises much more noticeably in response to sodium than others. And the frustrating part is that many people do not know they are salt sensitive until they start tracking their pressure carefully, or until a health event exposes the problem. That makes this especially relevant for older adults. Because after 60, the body often becomes less resilient in quiet ways that are easy to miss. Kidney function may still look acceptable on paper, but filtration may not be as efficient as it was 20 years ago. Blood vessels may not relax as easily. Hormonal systems that regulate fluid and pressure may become more erratic. The body may take longer to recover from excess sodium, and the pressure response may last longer too. And this is where people get caught off guard. They do not feel a dramatic reaction after eating something salty, so they assume nothing happened. But blood pressure can rise silently. The heart may be working harder without obvious symptoms. The vascular system may be under more strain even while the person feels normal enough to watch television, go to bed, and assume the day is over. But the body is still dealing with that load. It is still balancing fluid, still regulating vessel tone, still responding to the chemical environment created by that meal. And if a person already has hypertension, kidney disease, diabetes, sleep apnea, heart failure, or a past stroke or mini stroke, the system is often much less forgiving. That is why I want to be very precise here. I am not saying a pickle causes a stroke in every person. That would be irresponsible. Stroke risk is not built on one food alone. It is built on vulnerability, pressure patterns, blood vessel health, medical history, and repeated exposure to the wrong triggers. But when a person already has the conditions that make stroke more likely, a high sodium food can absolutely become part of the chain that pushes things in the wrong direction. And sometimes it does that more quickly than people expect. Because once pressure rises, the stress on the vessel walls rises with it. In some people, that may mean the heart works harder. In others, it may mean the brain circulation becomes more vulnerable. In others, it may mean the blood pressure that already runs a little high moves into a much more dangerous range for several hours. That is why some patients tell me they do not understand why their blood pressure is decent during the day, but unexpectedly high in the morning. They assume the number came out of nowhere, but very often, the answer is not nowhere. It is hidden in the previous evening. It is hidden in the salty dinner, the preserved side dish, the processed snack, the soup, the sauces, and the foods that did not feel excessive because none of them looked dramatic on their own. That is the pattern people miss. The body does not only respond to one huge mistake. It also responds to multiple smaller ones stacked together. A little sodium here, a little more there, a preserved vegetable on the side, a salty broth, a slice of processed meat, a packaged dressing, a restaurant meal with more sodium than expected. And suddenly the blood vessels are dealing with far more pressure than the person ever imagined. And here is what makes that even more concerning. A lot of people who are most vulnerable are the very people who believe they are eating reasonably well. They may have cut back on obvious junk food. They may avoid sweets. They may be trying to make healthier choices. But if they still lean on preserved vegetables, canned soups, salty side dishes, or light meals that are secretly sodium heavy, they may be creating a pressure problem without realizing it. So the question is no longer whether sodium can affect the bloodstream. It absolutely can. The real question is when the danger gets amplified the most, and why that risk becomes even greater when those salty vegetables show up at night, alongside other foods that quietly multiply the load. This is where the pattern becomes much easier to miss. A person looks at dinner and sees nothing alarming. Maybe a bowl of soup. Maybe a sandwich. Maybe some grilled meat, crackers, cheese, or leftovers from earlier in the day. And on the side, a few pickled vegetables, some preserved cabbage, or a spoonful of salty fermented vegetables that seem too small to matter. The meal does not feel reckless. It may even feel lighter than what many people would consider unhealthy. But inside the body, the math can look very different, because sodium has a stacking effect. One salty item may not seem extreme on its own, but when several moderate sodium foods show up in the same meal, the total load can become surprisingly high before the person ever notices. That is how people get into trouble. Not always through one dramatic food, but through combinations that feel normal. Soup already contains sodium. Processed meats often contain sodium. Cheese adds more. Crackers, sauces, bottled dressings, canned foods, restaurant meals, and packaged side dishes all contribute. Then those salty preserved vegetables come in on top of that and quietly push the meal into a range the body simply can't handle. And because it happens at dinner, the timing matters more than most people realize. At night, people tend to become less active. They are not walking around as much. They are not burning through the same routine demands of the day. The body shifts into a different rhythm. Then they lie down, go to sleep, and assume the digestive system and circulation will just take care of everything smoothly. But if that meal delivered a heavy sodium load, the body may spend the next several hours holding on to more fluid, adjusting blood vessel tone, and working harder to maintain pressure balance. That is one reason the word overnight is not just drama. It reflects a real pattern. For some people, the rise in pressure is not obvious while they are still awake. They may not feel anything unusual at all. Then morning comes, and the blood pressure number is higher than expected. Or they wake with puffiness, thirst, a dull headache, facial tightness, or that heavy internal feeling some patients describe without knowing how to explain it. In other people, there are no clear symptoms at all. That is what makes it dangerous. Blood pressure does not need to announce itself to be doing damage. Now here is where the mistake gets even bigger. People often underestimate preserved vegetables because the serving looks small. A pickle spear does not look threatening. A spoonful of sauerkraut does not look excessive. A side of salty cabbage does not trigger the same warning in the mind that chips or fast food might. But concentrated sodium does not care about visual size. A small portion can still deliver a meaningful amount, especially when it joins the rest of the meal. And that is why label reading matters far more than people think. If you only look at the front of the jar, you may see words like natural, fermented, traditional, garden, probiotic, or low calorie. None of that tells you the most important number for stroke risk and blood pressure control. The number that matters is sodium per serving. Then you have to look at what the company calls a serving, because that can be misleading too. Someone may eat 2 or 3 times that amount without realizing it. So they think they had a little, when in reality they may have taken in far more sodium than intended. This is one of the biggest reasons blood pressure control fails in people who feel they are trying. They are not always making terrible choices. They are often making misunderstood choices. They may have replaced obvious junk food with foods that sound healthier, but still contain enough sodium to create real vascular strain. That is why a person can sincerely say, "I don't even eat that badly," and still wake up to numbers that do not make sense. The hidden issue may not be sugar. It may not be fat. It may be the quiet accumulation of sodium, especially in the evening, especially from foods wearing a healthy disguise. And this is where I want to make the lesson practical. If you already have high blood pressure, a past TIA, kidney disease, heart disease, or you are simply noticing high morning readings, do not treat salty preserved vegetables as free foods. They are not harmless just because they began as vegetables. Treat them like sodium foods. That changes how you use them. That means keeping portions small. It means not pairing them with several other salty foods in the same meal. It means being especially careful at dinner. It means paying attention to soups, sauces, packaged broths, deli meats, cheese, canned products, and takeout meals on the same day. because the body responds to the total load, not the story you tell yourself about one item. There are also ways to lower the burden. If the product allows it, rinsing preserved vegetables can sometimes reduce some surface sodium. Choosing fresh vegetables more often is a much safer default. Using low-sodium versions when available can help. Building meals around whole foods instead of layered processed foods makes a difference. And if your doctor says potassium intake is safe for you, especially if you do not have kidney disease or medication issues that limit it, potassium-rich foods can support healthier blood pressure balance over time. But the simplest step is still the most powerful one: stop stacking salt at night. Because that is the trap. Not the single pickle. Not the single bite of cabbage. The trap is the entire dinner pattern that teaches the body to carry extra fluid and pressure into the hours when you are asleep and unaware. And once you see that pattern clearly, the next question becomes the one that actually protects you. What should you eat instead? Who needs to be most careful? And how do you lower this risk without becoming afraid of vegetables altogether? Now, this is where the message becomes much more hopeful, because the answer is not to fear vegetables. The answer is to understand the difference between a vegetable in its natural form and a vegetable that has been turned into a sodium-heavy preserved food. That distinction matters more than most people realize. And once you make it, the whole picture becomes clearer. Fresh vegetables are not the enemy here. In fact, in their natural state, vegetables are among the most protective foods for the heart and blood vessels. They provide fiber, antioxidants, minerals, and plant compounds that support vascular health over time. They help with blood pressure control, metabolic balance, and inflammation. So I want to be very clear. This is not a warning against vegetables. It is a warning against assuming that a food stays equally healthy after it has been soaked, cured, preserved, or packed with enough salt to change how your body handles it. That is the real lesson. A fresh cucumber and a heavily salted pickle may look related, but they do not behave the same way inside the body. A fresh cabbage dish and a salty preserved cabbage side dish may both come from the same plant, but nutritionally and physiologically, they are not the same experience. One supports your system with very little sodium burden. The other may place your blood vessels, kidneys, and blood pressure regulation under more strain, especially if you are already vulnerable. So if you want a simple rule you can actually use, here it is. If the vegetable tastes strongly salty, briny, sharply preserved, or comes from a jar, can, pouch, deli container, or restaurant side dish where sodium is likely concentrated, do not treat it like a free vegetable. Treat it like a sodium food. That one mental shift can protect a lot of people, because it changes how you portion it. It changes when you eat it. It changes what you pair it with. And most importantly, it stops you from giving it a health halo it may no longer deserve. Now, what are safer choices? The safest default is to lean more heavily on fresh vegetables, lightly cooked vegetables, steamed greens, salads made without salty bottled dressings, roasted vegetables, fresh cucumber, zucchini, carrots, broccoli, cauliflower, green beans, spinach, and other whole forms that have not been saturated with sodium. If you enjoy fermented foods, look for lower sodium options when possible. If you make them at home, be mindful that homemade does not automatically mean low sodium, but it may give you more control over the final amount. And if you do choose preserved vegetables occasionally, keep the portion modest and avoid building an entire salty meal around them. That means being careful with what else is on the plate. A preserved vegetable next to deli meat, canned soup, cheese, salty crackers, soy-based sauces, or restaurant takeout creates a very different risk pattern than a small amount beside a mostly fresh meal. That is how real prevention works. Not through panic, through pattern recognition. Now, some people need to take this more seriously than others. If you have high blood pressure, chronic kidney disease, heart failure, diabetes, a prior stroke, a transient ischemic attack, swelling problems, or morning blood pressure readings that seem unexpectedly high, this topic applies to you much more directly. If you have ever been told to watch your sodium, then preserved salty vegetables belong on that list too, even if nobody specifically named them for you before. And if you are on blood pressure medication, this matters for another reason. Some people assume medicine will simply erase the effect of a high sodium diet. It does not work that way. Medication can help control pressure, but it does not make the bloodstream immune to repeated sodium overload. In many cases, people end up fighting their own treatment by layering salty foods into their daily routine and then wondering why their numbers remain stubborn. That is one of the most common silent frustrations in blood pressure care. Now let me give you one more practical point that often gets ignored. Do not rely only on how you feel. People tend to think dangerous blood pressure should feel dramatic, but sometimes it does not. Sometimes the numbers are high and the symptoms are subtle, or completely absent. That is why home blood pressure monitoring can be so useful, especially if you are trying to spot patterns. If your readings are regularly higher in the morning, do not just blame stress or bad sleep automatically. Look back at what happened the night before. Look at the sodium. Look at the sauces. Look at the preserved foods. Look at the meal as a whole. Because patterns tell the truth even when symptoms do not. And of course, we also need to talk about warning signs no one should ever ignore. If you or someone around you develops sudden facial drooping, weakness on one side, trouble speaking, confusion, sudden loss of coordination, sudden numbness, a severe unexplained headache, or changes in vision, do not wait to see if it passes. Those can be signs of a stroke, and stroke treatment is time-sensitive. Fast action matters, when every second counts. In that moment, the priority is emergency care, not home remedies, not rest, and not delay. That is why this topic matters so much to me. Because stroke risk is not only built in dramatic moments, it is often shaped quietly, through repeated daily choices people do not realize are putting pressure on the system. A food can look innocent. A meal can seem ordinary. A habit can feel too small to matter. But the body keeps score, especially when blood vessels are already under strain. So if you remember one thing from this entire discussion, remember this. The danger was never the vegetable alone. The danger was assuming that every vegetable remains harmless no matter what is done to it. Once salt becomes the dominant feature, the food has changed. And for the right person, especially later in life, that change can matter far more than appearance suggests. I'm Dr. Marcus Evans, and my goal here is to help you understand these hidden health patterns before they become bigger problems. If this gave you a new way to think about what is on your plate, subscribe, share this with someone who watches their blood pressure, and keep paying attention to the foods that seem safe at first glance, because sometimes those are the ones that deserve the closest look.